Howdy folks, I'm here in beautiful Minsk, Belarus, and look, in the West we get a very particular narrative about Russia and Belarus. They're kind of the same, effectively the same country, same culture, same people, whatever. Not really true. There's a lot of similarities, a lot of the core are similar, but there's a few really notable differences. I'll run through two differences today between Belarusians and Russians. And of course, for the non-mathematicians out there, I'm talking about averages of a typical Belarusian compared to maybe a more typical Russian. I think one of the biggest differences are that Russians are a bit louder, a bit more brash, a bit more out there. You'll hear them from further away. They don't have a sense of being quiet. Well, they do. Like they can be quite civil as well, but you're much more likely to get an outgoing Russian. Yeah, a Russian who, let me turn you around. A Russian who's quite loud. Yeah. You're much more likely to get this. Let me just restart this. All right, let's go. So yeah, Russians are more likely to be more louder, make more jokes, laugh in public, more noise, yeah, more noise. And they often enjoy each other doing this. Like sometimes, like if you see a busker, for example, right, or a street performer, if you will, if you're in Russia, you know, some people will have some, I don't know, start dancing in this really loose way, or, you know, just really enjoy themselves, have a bit of fun. And what you kind of find is that other Russians enjoy watching and laugh at their fellow Russians when they're kind of getting loose and wild and crazy, right? They kind of laugh at each other. They really enjoy this. And they're quite fun. And this is something they actually share a little bit with Australians, this kind of, a little bit of a wildness, especially with a few drinks in them. Shit, mate. Anything could happen. But they're generally pretty good fun, and they're generally pretty good value because of this. But don't expect a lot of peace and quiet, right? Especially around drunk Russians. It's not going to happen. There is a lot of etiquette still in Russia. Like, you can't just be a fucking idiot. But, you know, you do have this kind of wild side to a number of them, and that's kind of core. And the acceptance of this, and even enjoyment in reveling in others' wildness, that's definitely in that Russian culture. Whereas Belarusian, man, they are incredibly polite. Very civil, very polite. You'll never hear anyone yell. Very rarely will you hear someone yell on the street, this kind of noise, do something silly. Going back to the example of a busker, they wouldn't just start dancing crazily around the busker and do this loose and wild behavior, right? They'll sit back, they'll watch, they'll film it, they'll maybe nod their head in time. They would barely even sing it under their breath, right? There's this kind of hyper politeness, hyper etiquette around politeness and not being loud at all. It is, So even I was at a festival with, I don't know, maybe a couple of thousand people a few weekends ago, and mate, it's pretty quiet. You'd be surprised. Pretty quiet. And what goes with that, of course, is a whole lot of very pro-social behaviour. You can look around. I mean, you watch all my videos, right? I mean, you'll get a good sense of what's going on here, and you can see, like, nothing's broken. There's no graffiti. No one's trying to steal or break anything off. There's no rubbish. Like, there's that kind of really strong surface level conformity thing going on here. Whereas Russians, they're not exactly animals. I mean, don't get me wrong. They're pretty decent, to be honest. I think they're harshly criticised as a whole, but they definitely do have this wild side to them that Belarusians don't. And you can tell here, I can tell the accent a bit, but you can tell here just by their behaviour who's the Russian tourist, right? That guy definitely is. I can hear him and see him. He's definitely Russian. So yeah, one huge difference is this kind of extroverted side, especially with alcohol, just to be a bit loose, wild and crazy, and then to enjoy each other. Whereas Belarusians, very, very reserved in public and with people they don't know, and have this super politeness. They're kind of extremes, to be honest. In the terms of what's available in the world, they're pretty extreme, down extreme different ends, I have to say. So that's one thing. Second thing is, look, Russia's a superpower to some extent. Obviously, dwindling power, dwindling influence. The US has kind of won the arm wrestle, winning the arm wrestle pretty comprehensively. Especially since the end of the Soviet Union. It's definitely been one-way traffic, but nonetheless, Russia still has an influence in the world. It has a lot of, nukes, oil, gas, has some economy. It's still a power, and it still has an empirical frame of mind, right? A frame of reference. a lot of history, a lot of great whatever writers and blah 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 blah. Has a deep culture, right? So the Russians really have this super deep sense of being Russian. Yeah, there's a real kind of patriotic. There's a lot of civilizational self-esteem for Russians. They have that empire self-esteem that you might get with Americans, for example. Maybe not as extreme as Americans, but high, right? High. There's something. Their country's something. Their empire's something, right? So they have this. This is very unusual. People crossing on the red. Holy shit. These are tourists, yeah? Because I'm right near the Vauxhall. So these will be tourists just walking across. Whereas Belarus, look, there's a bit of it here. A little bit of kind of, pride in being Belarusian, but not really, to be honest. A little bit of pride in their history, a little bit, but not much. Like, it's really quite down the other end. They're kind of like not that interested in their own stuff. Like, they don't feel like they have much of a history. They do feel it a little bit. Like, I don't want to overstate this, but at the same time, they kind of don't compared to Russians. And you kind of got this weird, almost like a conquered mentality in a sense, because they have been just controlled constantly. And this is a bit of a small country thing, right? Like, it's kind of like the victim of the big country and the small country. You've got Belarus that's been strongly influenced by larger countries, and this has probably affected the personalities here and vice versa, right? I mean, Australia's kind of the same in a sense. Like, we're also small, like Belarus is, and also controlled, right? We're controlled entirely by the US, for better or for worse. But we've kind of adapted and we've still got that empire mentality ourselves. We have that kind of arrogance, in a sense, or confidence or certainty of ourselves, that civilizational self-esteem that we have in Australia. Not as much as the US, but similar to Russia, I guess, in that respect. But Belarus, they don't really have it here. They don't really have it. The individuals have some kind of sense of self and self-esteem and self-respect. They definitely do, as people, but as a civilization, they don't. Especially when you compare to Russia. It really deeply contrasts. Because a part of their identity is Russia, right? Because they speak Russian, have the same pop culture, blah, 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 blah. And now with the current political environment, they've probably gone from being fairly neutral for several years leading up to the recent string of political events. And now they're a little bit more, obviously, in the Russian camp. But I suspect that when what happens now kind of finishes, you might find that we see that Belarus becomes a bit more diplomatic again, a bit more in the middle again. And you can tell by certain things that these countries are still negotiating things behind the scenes, right? All right, so there's two big differences, man, between Belarusian mentality and Russian mentality. But a lot of it's the same because they went through the same retraining program, right? They were retrained in feminism, and then kind of a hybrid Christianity feminism in the Stalin era. So they've had this same kind of core reprogramming, but these other parts have kind of stayed constant and really point to a clear differentiation. You can tell, you can distinguish between a Russian and a Belarusian. Just based on these things I've told you today, you can kind of tell the volume they're talking at in public. You can kind of tell. So anyway, that's my 2 cents on the two differences between Belarusians and Russians. As I say, the core is more or less the same, much like Australia is the same as the other Anglo countries. Same kind of deal, right? We have similar values, similar ideas. Yeah, okay. Americans are a bit more brash and loud than Australians are. Australians are a bit more laid back, chilled. But, in terms of, the core of getting along and what's right, what's wrong and all that kind of stuff, we're pretty bloody similar. And that's kind of what you get here with Belarus and Russia. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Chat soon.